With that, then, I would encourage you to take notes during the debate. If there are questions that you have about what debaters are doing or why they're doing it, I'll give you a chance to ask some of those questions at the end of the debate. And then we'll conclude the evening by talking about when all of you are going to be debating and what the first motions for the first two debates next Tuesday night are going to be. I'm going to turn it over now to Haley and let you call the House to order.
All right, I now call this House to order, and I welcome the Prime Minister to give a 5-minute speech on in favor of the proposition.
Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, the power of a democratic government is that policymakers and policies are held directly accountable to the people that they ultimately govern. We find it abhorrent that in America, more than any other Western democracy, people refuse to participate in that government and they refuse to ultimately vote for those policies that end up governing their lives. It is for that reason that we are happy to support compulsory voting in elections. We're going to have two planks to our model. First, we're going to make anybody pay a fine of $400 if they refuse to participate in the compulsory voting structure. We think that that's relatively clear. And second, we're happy to facilitate this right to vote by doing things like having voting holidays so people can get time off work in order to exercise this right, and doing things like driving people to the polls. I'm going to have 2 points in this debate. First, I'm going to talk to you about the nature of voter apathy, and second, I'm going to tell you about why this positively changes the democratic process. We think that at the point where you have the right to participate in a democracy, you have a duty to vote, and you have a duty to ensure that that democracy is ultimately able to function. So first, let's talk about the nature of voter apathy in the United States. We recognize that more than any other Western liberal democracy, for the most part, citizens don't participate in elections, whether that be the 40% turnout that we typically see in things like midterm elections and even lower turnouts in municipal and state elections, to the paucity of voting that we see with only a 60% voting turnout for who ultimately decides who the next president of the United States is. We think that that's abhorrent. So why do we think that typically people choose not to participate in their democracy? We think broadly that there's 2 reasons. First, because people have other demands on their time. We recognize that it is an inconvenience to have to take time out of your work schedule or take time out of your regular life to have to go drive to the polls and exercise this duty. We think that that's a large deterrent that makes people choose not to vote. But second, because they don't believe that their vote matters, we think that this is a collective action problem in the same way that pollution is a collective action problem, in which many individuals don't recognize that if they throw one soda can out the window, it's probably not that big a deal, but when everybody does it, you end up with a very polluted environment. We think the same way democracy doesn't function when individuals don't participate in it. We think that that's incredibly damaging to the democratic process, and we have to change that calculus. But before I move on, I'll take Daniel.
But why is voting such an important aspect of civic engagement? Can't people access civic virtue through other things like volunteering or being in their PTA or just being involved in politics?
Right, so we're going to bring you most of those pragmatic benefits in my second point, but really briefly, first because we think that it changes the perception of the mandate to rule when you know the individual who's elected was actually elected by a majority and not just whoever showed up to the polls on that particular day. I think that that's powerful, but second because we think that we get far better policy when politicians actually have to cater to the whole population and not just who they think is actually going to turn out. So why do we think that this changes the calculus for the voter? We think that now there is significant counter-incentive for you to overcome that apathy that you otherwise experience. We think that even if you don't believe, or that now you're forced to recognize that your vote actually does matter, that you do actually have an ability to effectuate policy, and we think that any other, like the inconvenience that you now have to take out of like making dinner or whatever, is a relatively small inconvenience compared to the $400 that you would otherwise have to pay. That's why we think that we're going to get far higher voter turnouts when we implement this policy. So second, let's talk about why we think that this positively changes the democratic process. We think that it changes it broadly on 3 levels. First, we think that it makes it so the individual citizen in that society actually becomes a far more direct participant in their democracy. We think that once you've overcome that initial threshold of actually having to go to the polls and vote, you're far more likely to do things like read newspaper articles because you know that you're going to be forced to vote either way. You might as well be informed. We think that this means that people participate in a deliberative democracy in a far more healthy way than they currently are doing in the status quo. That's a huge benefit that we bring to a government. But second, we think that it also fundamentally changes the way that candidates shape their platforms. We think that right now, you as a candidate have 2 burdens on you. You, one, have to galvanize people to go out and vote in the first place, and second, you have to convince them to vote for your policy. We think that at best, this is a huge drain of resources when political parties have both of those obligations foisted on them, but we also think that it makes incredibly radicalized rhetoric. Recognize that the reason reason that Donald Trump does things like says, oh, we're going to like lock up all Muslims and put them in a and put them in a system where we're essentially able to track them is because he's trying to strike fear into the hearts of white voters to try to incentivize them to go get out to the polls. He no longer has that incentive when everybody has to vote in the first place. But second, recognize that he also realizes that now Latinos and Muslims are always going to be part of that voting population, so he now no longer can alienate them to the point that he does in the status quo. We think this is true of all politicians. We think that you get far less incendiary rhetoric when you now recognize that you're going to have to cater to all individuals in that voting populace, not just whoever you think is going to vote. We also think that you're far more likely to do things like actually pass policy that caters to these groups of people, that actually deals with the problems that impact their life. But third, we think this is incredibly important because we think it changes the mandate to rule. We think that now you recognize that whoever was elected into office actually does have a legitimate right to be there, and you have to actually engage with their policy instead of just saying that we hate the ACA because we hate Obama because we think he was elected by a minority. For all those reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister for their speech and welcome the Leader of Opposition to give a 5-minute speech in favor of the opposition.
Here.
If you don't come to democracy, government says, democracy will come to you. The problem is that when democracy comes to you, it comes with force and fear, destroying the very tenets on which it was based, and erecting in their place a mockery of its former self. We hear a lot from government about why democracy is good for results. We don't really hear what the purpose of democracy is. That's what opposition is going to tell you, why it depends on fundamental respect for rights, why they completely erode that on their side of the house. Before I do, one miscellaneous point of deconstruction. So they tell us that there are two significant reasons why people don't vote. One is other demands on time. At the same time, they run voter holiday in their model. So they're already solving with a voter holiday, which we can also do on our side of the house for half of the problems they identify. So already their ground for which they're solving has pretty much narrowed half in this debate. We're fine with letting them defend that much narrower ground. Okay, so first point, what is the goal of democracy? We believe that democracy fundamentally is an instrumental means to the end of a society where people can feel that their rights are respected and can interact on a safe and respectful level with one another. Recognize that democracy in and of itself is literally just a method of making collective decisions. It doesn't imply that those decisions are going to be good, not at this time. You don't choose to live in a country simply because it's a democracy. A democracy can elect an autocratic leader, which then goes on to fundamentally trample over the rights of the people. The purpose of a democracy is to ensure that we get eventually to a society where rights are respected. We've done it so far because it's the best means we've found. This is, in the words of Tony Stark, why we fight, so we can end the fight, so we can go home, so that we can have a society where rights are respected and we're not compelled by the government to undertake actions that cause no harm to others, but cause extreme harm to our own civil liberties. This is the end goal of democracy, to secure rights, to ensure that people can speak or refuse to, if they don't want to interact and actualize in a society how they see fit instead of what the government prescribes as an acceptable form of citizenship. And I'll get to you in a moment. This is the goal of all good government. Democracy just happens to be the best means we've found so far. Don't deify the means, deify the ends, and don't sacrifice those ends for that means. Go ahead.
Has an activist choosing not to vote ever created a form of tangible and real change?
Maybe not for society as a whole, but we think it's still important to that individual. We think it gives them a platform which they can speak to the rest of society, to engage with their fellows and say, I am not voting because I believe that the system is so abhorrent that I cannot support it in any way possible. We think those conversations are extremely valuable. Those are the conversations that you silence on your side of the house by making sure that everyone has to participate in the government, even if they don't believe it represents them. Okay, second point, how compulsory voting fundamentally undermines rights. This is a pretty self-explanatory argument, but I'm going to walk through it just for government bench. So rights are fundamentally important in terms of their self-exercise. They are absolute and tautological, right? The reason that rights are valuable is because they enable people to enjoy their lives. We don't value rights for their social utility. We value rights because that is the end of social utility, to get us to a society where people's rights are respected and they can engage in a society on that level. If we valued rights only for their social utility, and this is the question that I'm going to pose to government bench that I want them to answer at some point in this debate. In a hypothetical society where religion is viewed as important to them as voting is viewed for us, would they be okay with the state commanding people to attend religious ceremonies to participate in the betterment of that state?
Sir.
If they say no, they're principally inconsistent and they lose this round. If they say yes, I don't think I really have to point out the harms of having the state enforce religion upon individuals. Those are pretty clear. Okay, back to my case then. Voting simply identified is a speech act. It is a statement of support for a candidate or a policy. Compelling any act destroys the necessary rights involved. You do not have a right to pay taxes. You have an obligation to do so, or the government will come and put you in jail. In the same way, if there is a draft involved, you do not have a right to serve in the draft. You thus have an obligation to do so. Taking the concept of a right away from voting and turning it into an obligation completely undermines the foundational tenets of our society that people have these rights, not at this time, and that we should respect them because they are valuable in and of themselves, not because they get us to some fairyland. So we think that right there, that's a principled line we should never cross. But even so, I'm going to give you 3 independent reasons now to reject government bench. First, because by eroding the respect for voting, you fundamentally erode the respect for all rights. When a government can say this activity is no longer a right, it is now an obligation, they fundamentally possess the ability to do so to anything else. That is, and I see the slippery degugliest grin upon Matt's face because he knows this is a potential slippery slope argument. But it works because the principle relies true. This rhetorical support could be granted, for example, in bringing back the draft, because you now have an obligation to serve your country in the same way that you have an obligation to vote to ensure that politicians can make the best decisions. And at the end of the day, we tell you that even if you don't buy any of our principled stance, if you think that the government ought to be able to compel anyone to do anything, we think that you don't get more informed voters. You get a bunch of people who are resentful of the government that they now have to take time out of their day to go vote, so they're not being fined, and they're just going to bow to whatever campaign spends the most money to get the most commercials on TV. That's already happening. They don't get more informed voters. They just get more voters who are already buying into all the crap that's on the airwaves. So at the end of the day, first they come today for your vote, and then tomorrow they come for your draft card. Rights are valuable because of that they are rights, because they allow us to get to a good society. Unless they can give you a competing version of the goals of democracy,
We thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Sam challenges us to take the bait of rights, but we're not going to, because we recognize on our side of the house that rights are only protected in a society that is informed by the will of the people. If we need a democratic governing society to actually enable us to have these rights that are meaningful, and we don't have that on our side of the house in the status quo, then we tell you that we need to solve that problem by ensuring that everyone participates in the mechanism that enables those rights to be protected. The difference between religion and voting is that religion isn't a mechanism for policy change and upholding the structure that allows rights to exist. You don't get rights from religion, although maybe Thomas Aquinas would argue that you do. Although we think on our side of the house, the most present and clear facilitator of rights is a government that is democratically elected, because it reflects the will of the individuals within. We agree with a lot of the things that Sam tells you, right? For the example, the idea that we need a democracy to solve collective action problems and make policy. The problem is that Joanna tells you how the rhetoric that we get out of our current political process obscures the policy discussion. We never have meaningful debates about what policies are going to be implemented because people are too busy aspiring to get rid of all the people we don't like because of the color of their skin or the ideology they have. They have to defend a meaningful democracy on their side of the house. What their challenge is going to be for the next 25 minutes is telling you how that sort of speech is meaningful or positive in terms of impacting our political process. And they're going to lose that argument. No. Second, though, in terms of no thank you, we think individuals have no incentive to get informed. This is what Joanna tells you, right? Like, if you don't think you're ever going to have a meaningful voice, and you don't think you're ever going to have any sort of reason to participate in the process, it creates a feedback loop where just democracy gets worse and worse and worse. We saw this in terms of ideology, as I'll explain later, in many countries that eventually led to things like genocide, where ideology became the dominant means of political identification. Not suggesting that might happen here, but it's certainly a possibility, right? When you mobilize individuals based on things like ethnicity, based on things like religion, those are the types of tangible policy harms that we see in our society. Then we get to this rights argument. No. We think the rights argument is problematic, as I mentioned earlier, for those two reasons. But we think it's particularly problematic when you look at the way that Joanna and I want to create a better democracy. The reason we think mandatory voting creates that is for the reasons that Sam never actually addresses in his speech, right? He never talks about the perception of rule being more legitimate when everyone is forced to buy into a process that requires them to be a participant in that individual election process, as opposed to just saying that a person is, well, I'm disaffected because I didn't actually vote, right? No one can claim that they didn't actually get or didn't have an opportunity to participate in the policymaking process because they're active participants on our side of the House. We think that they're far more direct participants as well, and I'll get to in a moment. They're more informed. No response to that from opposition. John even told you how this changes the platform of candidates, and I'm going to extend a little bit on that after I take Catherine.
Okay, so you're telling us that we're going to get a better democracy because we're going to have better informed voters, but how exactly are we going to do that? Because what you've told us is that just people will feel better about their government if they're voting.
Joanna tells you that there are two specific things that candidates must do if they want to get elected in the United States. The first is that they have to convince you that their policies and that they themselves are a good candidate and you should vote for them. The second thing they have to do is actually get you to show up to the polls to cast that ballot. What we tell you on our side of the House is that so much investment goes into actually getting you to show up, and the manner in which candidates do so is particularly damaging to democracy. The first way this is problematic is the manner in which they use rhetoric to amplify the base. This is Donald Trump using language that tries to demonize minorities and say that they need to be kicked out. This is the type of language that leads to things like genocide in Rwanda, where you do mobilize based on like the superiority of your ethnicity and your nationalism, right? Like these are the types of political conflicts that develop out of these types of forms of rhetoric. Even Bernie Sanders, though, has to make himself unique and use words like socialism to describe himself. Otherwise, his actual policies, which aren't really that socialist at all, wouldn't ever appeal to people. You mobilize the base and amplify your rhetoric to make the political process one that actually gets voters out to show up to the polls. That's bad. On our side of the House, how do we fix that problem? Well, we don't have to worry about amplifying the base. We take that out of the equation because everyone shows up. On our side of the House, we tangibly reform the rhetoric that occurs in American politics and say that no longer do you need to just amplify the base in order to have meaningful policies. What's the comparative in our world, right? The first thing that occurs is that politicians can no longer utilize that rhetoric and now have to compete on the actual policies that they have. You're now evaluating building the wall as opposed to letting in and having a path to citizenship. The reason that occurs is because people are voting on the basis of those issues rather than the rhetoric that occurs. But you also get rid of bad policy outcomes that are like a spin-off of having people vote by choice, right? Like gerrymandering and things of that nature. When you can utilize redistricting as a tool because not everybody votes, you gain a strategic advantage based on whether or not you're in power and have the ability to engage in those things. On our side of the House, there's no incentive for gerrymandering because all individuals are forced to vote. These are the types of policy changes that are tangible and actually produce a functioning democracy that better upholds the rights that Sam and Catherine are cared about. That's why we're so proud to propose.
We thank the deputy leader, the deputy prime minister, and we now call the deputy leader of opposition.
Here.
Honorable panel, what we think is that what we're getting, the narrative that we're getting from government, one, fundamentally misunderstands how democracy actually works, and I'm going to go over also the goal of democracy, which is what Sam talked about, and secondly also, he completely doesn't even talk about the entire point that we have about rights, which I think is ultimately the most important part of this debate, the crux of the debate, because we're not going to stand up in here and try to argue that, like, we don't want people to vote. Like, that's obviously not the point that we're trying to make here. We think that ultimately, if people are voting, that's probably a good thing, but the issue that we have here is that this is a rights conflict. There's a difference between strengthening the democracy and violating people's individual rights, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, I'm going to address some of the things that we heard from Matt before I jump into my point. So we think that, first of all, Matt says that rights are only protected by society. So if you contribute to a society, that's the only point at which your rights will actually be protected. But what we think is that rights aren't given to you by government. You have these rights by being alive. If you're part of a society, you have the right to have these rights. Like, this is something that's inalienable. If you're part of a democracy, you have the right to free speech. You have the right to vote. These are rights that are yours. You don't need to have a government to tell you that these rights are yours. So ultimately what we think, and what Sam has told you already, is that not voting is a form of political expression. It is a form of speech. And therefore, if you force someone to vote, you're violating their right to freedom of speech. It's as simple as that. And what Sam tells you is that when you do not vote, you do not participate in the political system. You do not support the system whatsoever. In 2008, there was a study done that 15% of people who do not vote don't vote because they think that the system does not serve them. They do not support the system whatsoever. That 15% of non-voters are an important group of people, and we have to support them. We have to allow them to access their rights successfully. I'll take Joanna.
Okay, so is that system more or less likely to serve them when politicians now have an incentive to cater to all interest groups in society and the policies
that directly impact them. Okay, so we actually don't think at all that having compulsory voting is actually going to get candidates to try to advocate for all different groups of people. We think instead that the rhetoric that we hear from people like Donald Trump is actually going to increase, because the thing that's really successful about Donald Trump's rhetoric is that it appeals to a mass group of racist people, and we think that ultimately the masses will continue to grow if we let this rhetoric happen. We think that ultimately, if there's big groups of people who believe in something, and now that big group of people gets bigger, then I think biologically, like at the same time, that rhetoric is going to get even bigger at the same time. And so what we worry is that we're not going to get more informed voters. We're not going to get people who actually are contributing consciously and more effectively to the political system. Instead, we're going to get people who either one just don't write anything, or draw something crazy on a ballot and turn it in because they don't want to contribute to society and they'll find a way not to do it, or otherwise they're continue to provide, they're not going to actually be more informed. They're just going to what Sam told you, they're going to believe what's going on, they're going to believe some of the propaganda and rhetoric, and they'll just contribute to the society in the same way. We still don't really get a mechanism for how voters will be more informed, or how this will make democracy better in general. Just because somebody is compelled to speak doesn't mean that that's going to make that speech more effective. It doesn't mean that it's going to make the result of that speech more effective. And so we don't see how any of these things are actually going to happen. But I think overall, the bigger issue that we have here is that, regardless of what actually, the outcome of compulsory voting, regardless of what that outcome is, the fact that we're compelling people to speak if they do not want to is a problem. And we think that ultimately, when you violate someone's fundamental rights, or when you violate someone's right to speak, we also kind of degrade the nature of all other types of rights. And that is part of the problem that we have, is that when rights are all kind of equal, and they're in the same fact that they all have the same amount of utility for a person, and so when you degrade the quality of one right, and you degrade the necessity of one right, you degrade the necessity of all rights. Back up.
Right. Government compels citizens to be on jury duty, but they do not tell them what to say or what their opinion should be. How is this significantly different from that civic obligation?
Because I think for one thing that not every single person in the entire world is an entire country is compelled to engage in jury duty. We think that this is not a comparative. We think that ultimately not every single person is going to be compelled to go to jury duty. Not every single person, we don't think that every single person actually going to jury duty is the same thing as contributing to the society in a voting way. We think that ultimately when people, we think that the comparison to compelling people to be part of a religious community or attend religious events is a much more likely comparison to voting. We think that ultimately when we have things that are supposed to be integral rights to us, when we make them obligations, they no longer have the status of a right. We worry that this is going to be a serious issue for people and the way that they see themselves in the society. If we make people tools for democracy, then they lose their utility in that society as an individual. And ultimately that's what we think that we do. People are supposed to have rights because that's integral to their functionality and their ability to self-actualize as an individual. They don't have rights so that the democracy in general can have a better vague idea of what's a better democracy. And so ultimately what we think is that we don't see any tangible benefits to this, other than people will be compelled to do something that they don't want to do. And with the real tangible disadvantage that we see is that people will not have their rights being honored. They will not have the situation as they are an individual being honored. And ultimately we'll see the degradation of democracy overall. Thank you.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and now welcome the Member of Government to give their speech.
Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate has largely focused on what the parameters of the government can place on individuals and their actions in regards to the state, and also whether or not the speech and the rhetoric that is created by voting or the lack of voting is valuable. My speech today is going to cover both, and all of my deconstruction will be woven in. make people show up to the polls, but government cannot tell them what to say. We believe that it is absolutely within the parameters of the government to bring them there, and then individuals can express their choice. I will take back at Daniel.
Yes. See, the thing is, when you go to the polling booth, you're forced to choose between a false dichotomy. Your choice is to legitimize either one candidate or another. In the jury selection process, you can opt out of it. That's not the same as it completely fallacious.
All right, so we think that in general, what perhaps opening government missed in their model is that obviously there's always a write-in slot where you can write in someone else. We also would support something like a little box that says no candidate applies or not interested in anyone. We think that are not applicable. We think that those are all perfectly reasonable things that can enshrine rights, but still get all of the benefits that opening government talked about. So that's why we believe that constitutionally we are absolutely in line when we are able to compel individuals to come to the polls, but we certainly cannot tell them what to say. That is within the scope of constitutionality. And my second point, I'm going to talk about why perhaps the only benefit they have on their side of the house, of the political expression, no thank you, of not voting, is ultimately illegitimate. We believe that in general, we choose to protect the right to express yourself in any way, shape, or form. But we only care about that expression in the form that it creates some kind of civic good. In the instance that it actually contributes to the marketplace of ideas. What does abstaining from voting mean? That isn't a statement. That is literally a null statement. You are ultimately going into nullability. You are taking yourself away from that political discussion and forcing yourself into the desert of non-discussion. You are not making a statement. Now, certainly they try to say, oh, well, they're going to talk to their friends about why they didn't vote. Well, actually, probably not. We're not quite sure what social discourse that's going to change, as opposed to, I went to the polls and I chose not to vote for anyone. Here's why none of the candidates fit my specific meaning. But we do believe that ultimately, this form of non-speech, this form of actively exempting yourself from going to the polls, doesn't form any form of benefit towards that social discourse. We don't believe that it helps the individual self-actualize when they don't choose to vote. We don't believe that it helps society come to any larger conclusions about how they should treat minorities and about how they should begin to form policy. We think that instead, it is either the apathy that opening government told you about, or it is perhaps, in the minority, those individuals who want to make a statement. We believe that those individuals are making a statement. That potential right that they have to freedom of expression in this way is not legitimate. We don't believe that it is a valuable form of expression. And because we proved that to you, and because we proved to you that it is absolutely within the constitutional scope of the United States to compel you to show up, but then not tell you what to say, we believe that it absolutely provides the benefit to the society that we want to see. A truly democratic society where everyone does contribute to that social discourse, where everyone does contribute to that marketplace of ideas, and we are able to form a more whole and good society. We believe that this is absolutely critical to having a better union.
We thank the member of government for their speech and call the member of opposition to give theirs.
When Sarah addressed to you that non-speech provides no civic good, what we would say, and what I will bring to you today, is how non-speech is in fact ensuring a greater civic good. That if you are disinterested, and if you are dissatisfied with the political process, the value of your speech is quite a lot more valuable when it's spoken in silence. Necessarily, you are voicing an opinion when you choose not to vote. You are voicing the opinion either of dissatisfaction with the system, or you are voicing the opinion of your disinterest. Both are valuable in the democratic process, and I will be describing why. What Sarah seems to fail to recognize also is that this non-speech is not just important for its own sake, or for the greater goods that it provides to a civic society. It also goes down to the moral fiber of the individual. For example, in what opening government brought to you, or what opening opposition brought to you, if I have an ethical disinterest or dissatisfaction with the policies of socialism or with racism, and I'm forced this coming November to pick between Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, I think that's a rather serious moral harm that I would have to be faced with as an individual trying to make ethical decisions in this society. I think abstaining would be a perfectly acceptable choice. Not this time. I'm going to bring to you 2 points today. First, I'm going to talk about how voting, or how this compulsory voting, creates an illusion of authority within society. And then second, I'm going to talk about who are the people who tend to vote, and also why it is good that these people who tend not to vote stay home. So let's get into that material. Before I do though, actually, how about we listen to Matt?
If you're moral quandary, why didn't you just use the ballot that already exists with that write-in slot and write it no thanks?
Okay, it's nice that you're bringing, constructing a model like in a POI halfway into the speech. But we think that really, even if that does exist as an option, we think still compelling somebody to go and participate in that democratic form is still an objection to those moral objections that they may have to that system. So now, what is this also creating? So when people come to the polling booth and they give leaders this claim to authority, what Joanna talked to you about, she said that the leader is seen as legitimate when everybody votes. What could be a potential problem with that? When we look at societies that allow for compulsory voting, giving a leader a false claim to this authority and telling by claiming that everybody votes, their leader's actions truly represent the will of the people, is a false claim because it represents somebody's compelled action and not actually a democratic will. We think that when people think and internalize the obedience that they have from the state, because they also recognize and they look at leaders, they say, oh, this person who's been elected has some divine authority now because everybody's been compelled to vote and the election had a 100% turnout and they had 60% favorability within that populace. Oh, all of their decisions just must be okay. We're already moving towards an autocratic state with the amount of executive orders that the past president has had. The authority invested in our leaders is something that we should be cautious about, and we don't want to give that legitimacy, and especially such as Obama being criticized because he didn't get there was a low turnout during his vote. We think that's a good thing in our society. We think it's good to have our leaders criticized and to not have them shielded by this false image of legitimacy. We think that's harmful, and we think abstaining cuts through that fiction. Abstaining says that when half of America stays home, that person is probably not an effective leader, and that those two people involved in that candidacy, involved in that election, was probably a false dichotomy between, like South Park, a douche and a turd. I think that when you're faced with that decision, when you're faced with that completely ridiculous false dichotomy, you should stay home. You shouldn't give the system authority. No, not at this time. So who are the people who tend to stay home, and why should they not vote? Well, we think that there's also a greater social benefit. So Sarah brings to you, oh yeah, the civic virtue. We get everybody involved in society, and somehow, all the civic processes will eradicate these problems of discrimination and empower minorities and such things. Well, what we think is that actually those people would actually be impacted quite harmfully by this process. Now, what happens actually in reality is that people do stay home, and people don't decide not to vote because they are disinterested, and they often are only voting in elections and things that matter to them. So there are not just non-voters and voters. There are, for the most part, occasional voters, people that come out to election for an issue that really matters to them, like abortion, or birth control, or weed, or something that really is important to them. Now, what's wrong with this, though? What is the harm to these really interested or people that vote on issues that are impacting their lives and proximate to them in their society? Well, if everybody just comes to the polls, let's say on an issue of marijuana, or if everybody just comes to the polls on an issue of reparations for slavery, or if everybody comes to the polls on an issue of birth control, the minorities that these issues are important to get their voices drowned out in this overwhelming majority of everybody else's voices. We think that when less people vote, that's perfectly fine, because if everybody came to the elections, they necessarily wouldn't be best representing these minority interests that Sarah has brought to in this debate. It's for these reasons that we're proud to oppose voting. Thank you.
We thank the member of opposition for their speech and call the government whip for the final speech for their bench.
Mr. Speaker, today I am going to crystallize this debate for you with three main questions. First, who gets better democracy? Second, can the government compel you to vote? And third, is non-speech truly meaningful? And so all of my deconstruction is kind of going to be interwoven. So, in my first point of, does this democracy create better goods? This is something that the top half really liked to hit us on, is because the individual becomes more active in this process because the individual has to become active in this process. And so a larger number of people are going to be more involved and more interested in what's going to happen. So this isn't necessarily going to be absolutely 100%. Not necessarily everybody is going to be going out and doing research, but a larger number of people than we have right now in the status quo are going to go out and do some research, and that is necessarily going to get better democracy and a better world for us here in the United States. And also, it means that politicians are going to have to cater to all voters because they're going to be held more accountable because everybody is going to have to come out and vote. All of the moderates are going to be mobilized, so people on the more extreme ends are already more likely to come out to the polls. So then those extreme ends, not this time, are going to be balanced out by all of the moderates that now have to go to the polls and need to make a choice. I'll take it.
Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, believed that global warming was a myth and was prepared to sink the boats of migrants coming to Australia, was elected with 65% of the vote and 100% turnout. How does that prove that we don't get more radicals or that everyone is better represented?
Well, what I think, what's going to happen is it doesn't really matter. What really happens is we're going to hold politicians more accountable because we have a very, very large population, and Australia isn't necessarily a good corollary because, like, countries are different. Can the government compel you to vote? And that's something that my partner, Sarah, really brought to you, is about constitutional obligations that already exist that are very similar to having somebody go and vote. Because citizens have a civic duty to be called as a witness in a criminal trial. They can be subpoenaed and forced to come and speak. Jury duty is an obligation, and all of these things are something that makes the country better and gives us a better world. And so and people don't have a forced choice, and that's a false dichotomy that the opposition bench is bringing, is that people are going to be forced to choose one candidate or the other. But there's always a write-in option. Now at this time, and they're going to say that, oh, it wasn't brought up in the model, but should their model have been just the normal ballot? Like, we can already assume the ballots are going to be similar, and so this write-in option is still going to exist. So if a person wants to point out the ridiculousness of the system, they can write in Donald Duck for president. And so we are forcing a person to make a choice, like my partner brought you. And so now I want to move into, is non-speech meaningful? No. So, the problem is, in the status quo, when a person chooses not to vote, they are not distinguishing themselves from the people who don't vote because they're lazy or because they don't care. And so, a person choosing not to vote is not a choice to speak out against the government, it is a choice to do nothing, and no change has ever been done when somebody chooses to do nothing. And so, that's what we're really going to get on our side of the house, is because government should matter to people. And so, we have people in the status quo don't necessarily talk to friends, and so what we do is we give, by forcing somebody to vote and forcing a person to say, write in Donald Duck for president, because they want to point out the craziness of the system, that forces a person to make a choice and distinguish themselves. And so then that actually gives them a better way to express themselves and point out the ridiculousness of the system than just by doing nothing. And so all of their ideas by saying that we're going to be forcing a person to speak and all of their rights arguments just fall. Because we are not forcing a person to choose. We are giving them an outlet to show the ridiculousness of the system if they want to. And if they don't want to and they were choosing not to vote before because of apathy, then we get them up and we get their opinions to be counted, and so we necessarily get better democracy. So that is why on our side of the house, we get a better government, we get better rights, and we get a better United States of America. We are proud to do so.
and gentlemen, I know that you've heard 7 speeches today and you've almost been here for about 3 hours, but I really want to tell you is that the most important thing from the opposition bench and from me and my partner is this idea that when we want to have this goal of democracy for the United States, our goal is to have quality, not a quantity of votes, right? And that is what is most important. So in my whip speech today, first I'm going to talk to you about, does compulsory voting improve the voting process? And second, I'm going to talk to you about, does compulsory voting infringe on our rights? First off, does it improve our voting process? First, I'm going to talk about the voters, second about the politicians, and third about the actual political process itself. So first on the voters. Proposition keeps talking about how we're going to compel specific individuals to have more of an interest in our voting process because we're going to force them to the polls. But there's a little bit of a problem with this, right? Because if you have this individual who has agoraphobia and is afraid of people and you force them to go to the polls, you force them to go to the actual place, it doesn't mean, no thank you, that they're magically going to have this interest in reading the news, making sure that their vote actually counts. If the government is forcing you to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to put in the effort to do it right, okay? So what we can turn the problem of this, no thank you, is that you're not going to have actual substantive votes that contribute to the political process and make it better. Moreover, we think that when closing proposition talks about, oh, well, they don't actually have to really vote, they can just put in someone else's name in, or just not really put in anything at all, we think that doesn't even solve the problems that the opening proposition presented to you when he talked about voter apathy and the fact that people don't really involve themselves in the political system. We don't think that stands. No thank you. Moving on to the politicians. We think that, so proposition talks to you about how these politicians are going to become more generalized in their campaigning, right? They're going to try to cater to all of the individuals, but we think that that doesn't really happen when you institute compulsory voting. We think that what we talked about on opposition is that you're still going to have radical voters because you're going to do whatever it takes to get anyone to vote for your particular side, even if they are forced to vote. We don't think that you're going to erode radicalism on your side of the house. When Stephen comes up here and says, like, oh, you're going to get radical politicians, oh, but it doesn't really matter. We think that you're not going to solve these problems of this radicalized political system that we have. I'll take back half at the end of this point. But third, on the political process, we think that when you force individuals to actually vote, you're not going to improve the actual political system. You're not going to provide for these individuals to actually give their opinions. And when we focus on what my partner Daniel really talked to you about, this idea of this false representation, or when you compel individuals and the mass majority of people to go out to the polls to vote on issues that they don't really care about, you're going to have politicians who think that they're representing the people, but they actually don't. They're actually representing the opinions of people who don't really care. We don't think that is helpful in our side of the house. Yeah.
You told us that some of the votes that we would be getting are not valuable. What makes one vote more valuable than another? And if it's based upon intelligence, we can give it voting for only people with a certain IQ or a certain amount of knowledge.
Sure. We think that the votes that actually matter in our democracy are the votes of people who actually want to vote. To contribute to the system and to make it better. No, thank you. Second of all, does compulsory voting infringe on our rights? We had a little bit of this discussion on the top half today, right? Proposition tells you that our rights are made by the will of the people, but what we tell you is that these rights are unalienable, and these rights include things such as the freedom of speech. And while we think that, no thank you, opposition really values this idea of the freedom of speech, what's more important, especially in the political process, is this idea of non-speech. We think that non-speech is quite valuable in the system because of the fact that it allows individuals to express their views on the political process without contributing to a